The fundraiser was packed. I stood on the stage holding the Employee of the Year plaque, but my husband David wasn't clapping. Instead, he stood up in the front row and calmly told the entire board of directors that I had falsified the quarterly reports. He didn't yell. He spoke with a soft, pained voice, acting like a grieving partner. The room went ice cold. My mentor, the CEO, looked down at his shoes. Nobody defended me. I didn't even try to speak. I just stood there in the spotlight holding a heavy piece of wood, feeling my life vanish. The walk back to our table felt like it took hours. The silence in the ballroom wasn't the kind that comes from a lack of noise. It was the kind that comes from collective judgment. I sat down next to David, my hands trembling so hard the metal plaque rattled against the tablecloth. He reached over and placed his hand on mine, a gesture that looked supportive to anyone watching from across the room, but his grip was firm and cold. He whispered that he was doing this for my own good, that he couldn't live with the lie anymore. I looked at the CEO, Marcus, a man I had considered a second father for over a decade. He was the one who had encouraged me to push the boundaries of our department's growth. He knew exactly where those numbers came from. He had signed off on every single one of them in private late-night meetings in his office. When the event finally ended, Marcus didn't come over to console me. He pulled David aside instead. I watched them through the glass doors of the lobby. Marcus was nodding, looking relieved, as if David had just handed him a life jacket in a sinking ship. The next morning, I wasn't allowed past the security desk at the office. My keycard didn't beep, it just flashed a flat, red light. The head of HR met me in the lobby with a cardboard box. She wouldn't meet my eye. She said that in light of the public admission made by my husband, the company had to protect its integrity. There would be no internal investigation. There would be no chance for me to show the emails or the handwritten notes Marcus had left on my desk. They were choosing the cleanest narrative. I went to Marcus's private home that evening, thinking that away from the board and the cameras, he would be honest. I stood on his porch in the biting wind, waiting. When he finally opened the door, he didn't invite me in. He stood in the narrow opening, looking at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. I asked him why he hadn't said anything at the fundraiser. I reminded him that he was the one who told me to adjust the projections to secure the merger. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and told me that the world doesn't work on fairness. He said that David had come to him weeks ago, worried about my mental state and my obsession with the numbers. Marcus told me it was easier for everyone if the blame stayed with one person, someone who was already being questioned by her own husband. It was a masterclass in convenience. By siding with David, Marcus saved the merger and his own reputation. He sacrificed my career to buy himself another 5 years of stability. He told me to take some time off and find a good therapist. Then, he gently shut the door. I stood on that porch, looking at the expensive wreath on his door, and realized that my loyalty had been a one-way street for 12 years. I was the bridge they had both walked across to get where they wanted, and now that they were on the other side, they were perfectly happy to watch that bridge burn. I walked back to my car, the cold air finally starting to feel like the only thing that was real. This wasn't the first time David had rewritten my reality to suit his needs. Looking back, our marriage was built on a series of small, calculated erasures. When we first met, I was the one with the ambition, the one who worked late shifts to put him through law school. But once he had the degree, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, my career was stressful for the family, and my successes were lucky breaks. He had a way of leaning into my ear at parties and telling people I was struggling with my nerves if I ever disagreed with him in public. I used to think he was protecting me. I realize now he was just planting seeds in the minds of everyone we knew, preparing the soil for the day he would eventually bury me. It was the same pattern with our social circle. I was always the expendable one. When his sister borrowed $5,000 from our joint savings and never paid it back, they'd told me I was being materialistic for bringing it up. When his friends made jokes at my expense during weekend trips to the country house, he would laugh along, later telling me I needed to lighten up and stop being so sensitive. I was the buffer between him and his own flaws. If the house was messy, it was my failure. If he missed a deadline, it was because I had distracted him. I was the shock absorber for every bump in his life, and I had been so busy absorbing the impact that I didn't realize I was being flattened. The realization hit me in our kitchen, 2 days after the fundraiser. I was making coffee and I noticed David checking his reflection in the toaster, smoothing his hair with a satisfied smirk. He wasn't a man burdened by the weight of destroying his wife's career. He was a man who felt he had won. He had successfully transferred all of his own insecurities and my professional power into his own hands. I was now the unstable wife who needed his guidance, and he was the long-suffering husband. I watched him, and for the first time the man I had lived with for 10 years looked like a total stranger. The boundary was crossed on a humid Thursday afternoon. I returned home early to find a moving truck in our driveway. David wasn't there, but 2 men were hauling my grandmother's antique desk, the one piece of furniture I truly loved, into the back of the van. When I called him, his voice was breezy, almost cheerful. He told me he had sold it to a colleague. He claimed we needed the liquidity now that I was unemployed. He didn't ask. He didn't even warn me. He simply liquidated my history to pay for his comfort. When I tried to protest, he used that tone again, the one that suggested I was losing my mind. He told me that my emotional attachment to objects was exactly why Marcus was worried about my performance at the office. Later that evening, I found a set of legal documents hidden in his briefcase. They weren't just about the desk. He had initiated a process to have me declared mentally unfit to manage our joint assets. He was using the public scene at the fundraiser as his primary evidence. He wanted total control over the house, the savings, and the narrative of our life. It was a financial and legal execution disguised as a husband's concern. I sat on the floor of my empty office, staring at the spot where my desk used to be. The begging stopped. The urge to explain myself to him, to Marcus, or to the world simply evaporated. I realized that you cannot negotiate with someone who profits from your destruction. I didn't cry. I didn't scream when he walked through the door an hour later. I just watched him. I stopped looking for a way back into his world and started looking for a way out of mine. The internal tether finally snapped. I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't leave a dramatic note on the pillow. Instead, I waited for the weekend when David headed up to our country house to celebrate his promotion with the very people who had watched me fall. I stayed behind, claiming I needed more rest. The moment his car cleared the driveway, I began the quiet work of a ghost. I didn't seek revenge. I simply reclaimed my reality. I met with a forensic accountant I'd hired in secret. I handed over the encrypted drive I had kept, the one containing the original, unedited quarterly reports and the emails Marcus thought he had deleted. I didn't leak them to the press. I sent them to the regulatory board and the company's primary investors. I moved into a small, sun-drenched apartment on the other side of the city. I changed my number and closed the joint accounts before David even reached the cabin. The consequences for them were not a result of my anger but of their own choices. Without me there to absorb the friction, David and Marcus turned on each other within a month. When the investors started asking questions about the real numbers, Marcus didn't hesitate to throw David under the bus to save his own skin. David's reputation as a protective husband crumbled the moment he was caught in a legal deposition trying to explain why he'd lied about his wife's work to cover his own tracks. There is a quiet peace in my mornings now. I wake up to a room that belongs only to me. I don't miss the country house or the frantic dinners. I miss the person I used to be, but I am learning to like the person I am becoming. There was no big confrontation, no final screaming match, just a clean break and a long, deep breath. I walked away with my dignity intact, leaving them to fight over the ruins of the lies they built together. I am finally moving forward, and for the first time in 10 years I can hear my own thoughts. Final closing. They say silence is a sign of weakness, but I've learned it's actually a superpower. When you stop fighting for a seat at a table where you aren't respected, you realize you don't need the table at all. My life isn't loud anymore, but it is honest. I don't look over my shoulder to see if David or Marcus are watching. I'm too busy looking at the horizon. I lost a career and a marriage, but I found my own life. And in the end, that's a trade I'd make every single time. I am free. It's strange how quickly a reputation can dissolve when there is no one left to hold it up. After I left, I heard from a former colleague that the atmosphere at the firm had turned toxic. Without my management style, the one David called obsessive and Marcus called rigid, the cracks in the foundation became canyons. The merger they sacrificed me for didn't just stall, it imploded. It turns out that investors don't just buy numbers, they buy the trust of the people behind them. When it came out that the Employee of the Year had been discarded over a husband's lie, the narrative of the company's family values became a joke in the industry. I spent those first few months in my new apartment relearning the sound of my own voice. It's a terrifying thing to realize how much of yourself you've edited away just to keep the peace. I would catch myself reaching for the phone to ask David's permission to buy a specific brand of tea, or checking the clock to make sure I wasn't taking up too much space with my hobbies. It took time to understand that the instability he accused me of was actually just my spirit trying to survive his cage. One evening, I ran into Marcus at a grocery store far from our old neighborhood. He looked older. The sharp, polished edge of the CEO was gone, replaced by the tired eyes of a man who knew his best days were behind him. He started to say something, maybe an apology, maybe another excuse, but I just nodded politely and walked past him. I didn't need his explanation. I had already given myself the closure he was too cowardly to provide. The most profound change, however, was in how I viewed David. I used to think he was a mastermind, a man who had orchestrated my downfall with surgical precision. But from a distance I saw him for what he truly was, a small man who could only feel tall by cutting the legs out from under the woman he claimed to love. He wasn't a villain in a movie, he was just a person who chose convenience over character every single time. And while he is still out there trying to find someone else to subsidize his ego, I am here. I am whole. I'm quiet. And for the first time in my life, I am not waiting for the other shoe to drop.